This is David Dumke, the director of the UCF Prince Mohammad bin Fahd Program for Strategic Research and Studies. I'm honored to be joined by a colleague, Dr. Hakan Ozoglu, a professor of history at UCF, as well as the director of the Middle East Studies Program. Thanks for joining us, Hakan.
Nice to be here.
You're currently doing a Fulbright in Istanbul and writing a book, but we thought we'd talk to you today about some of the events going on inside Turkey and in the region. And perhaps you could give us your assessment as well as provide perhaps a historical framework for some of this.
Sure.
So I'd like to start with the recent events in Syria.
Okay.
Turkey is currently conducting an offensive against the Kurds there that have been allied, among others, with the United States. What are the objectives of this offensive, and what does it mean for Turkish foreign policy?
The question can be answered several ways. If you ask the government official statement is that they're trying to secure the borders because on the other side of the border there is a military or militant organization that is hostile towards Turkey, and that organization now getting help from the United States of America because of offensive towards the ISIS. Turkey sees that as a threat, and Turkey wants to neutralize that threat. But the skeptics have also, especially for the timing of this operation, have other views that they put forward. One is that Turkey now is trying to engage fully into the future shaping of the Middle East, if you will, but especially in Syria. So at least they have to have a large military force within Syria, so that in later negotiations they can have a better saying. The other group of skeptics also are thinking that this is also helping President Erdogan's bid for next term coming elections for internal politics. It is always an amazing opportunity for those in power to engage in military operations that are successful, and even this operation, it seems that even the opposition have nothing but to support it and come along with the government.
Of course, there are dangers in this offensive as well.
Definitely. The dangers is that what you're doing is that you're trying to walk on a tightrope in a windy day. There are many external powers have bases, like United States were involved heavily, and in manpower too, and Russia is there, Iran is there in a certain extent. So you have to, and Turkey is conducting behind the doors negotiations with these powers. But the interesting stuff is that Russia and United States are rivals, and obviously they have different interests. So it's very hard for Turkey to please all sides, and we will see how Turkey will walk on that tightrope.
You mentioned a minute ago about this in part being about shaping the new Middle East. So I guess my question to you is, where does Turkey see itself in the new Middle East? You had a long period after the Ottoman Empire where Turkey wasn't present or as visible, and then you had sudden Turkish influence, and then you've had something in between since.
Well, Turkey definitely. When I say Turkey, keep in mind that there are skeptics, and Turkish public opinion is split in 50-50. This is very important to keep in mind. It's very wrong to see Turkey as one political entity and one opinion. We're talking about government and those who vote for the government. Within that group, but they have the power obviously to lead Turkey. Within that group, this neo-Ottomanism, that is to say Turkey taking the leadership of the region at least, if not in terms of territorial ambitions, but political influence among the Sunni groups over there to counter the Iranian, this historic rivalry, is quite important. And they see this as an opening, and they just want to be in the game.
Being in the game is one thing, but of course there are others that also believe that they should be leading the Sunni side of the equation here. So Turkey's had some tension with Egypt and Saudi Arabia, for example. How does that fit in?
That's the old power struggle business that will play out its cards in the near future. Saudi Arabia definitely has the ambitions to do it. So Turkey and Saudi Arabia relations now are a bit tense, but Turkey is trying to gather support from, let's say, Qatar, for example, and other Sunni countries and other oppositional groups, for example, within these Sunni countries. And so there is also competition for the influence in the region to be a major regional power within the Sunni world in the Middle East. There is a age-old competition, of course, between the Sunni world and the Shiite world, between the Ottoman Empire and in the past it was materialized as the Ottoman Empire and the Persian Empire, Safavid, and later the Iranian state. But that still continues. The problem with the Sunni side is that, yes, in the Sunni side, that's historically, there is not one unit. There are groups that are vying for power. Egypt is also an extremely important example with a strong military.
And Egypt and Turkey, of course, have had a historical rivalry of sorts that dates back.
That's definitely true, yes. So it's an amazing puzzle, actually. If you want to chart a diagram on the wall, you're going to see that the rivalries and loyalties just draw an amazingly complicated picture. People who make predictions, they make predictions on a daily basis. They take a snapshot of what it is today, and it's actually, the picture comes out very blurry anyway, and they make a prediction about the future. I always shy away from making the predictions, but because these are only speculations. I do so just for entertainment, in a sense, not because anyone knows that that scenario will play out, because there are many unknowns that we don't know how those effects get into and how they play into how they have to change the political landscape of the region.
I want to ask a little, again, keeping focus on foreign policy, but more the history of it. Since Turkey became a republic, a lot of the emphasis was on Turkey as a European state. Mm-hmm. Now you're talking about some of the neo-Ottomanism.
Yes.
Is there a consensus on where Turkey wants to go, or is this, obviously people who have followed Turkish policy over the last decade or so have seen kind of a zig and zag, kind of Middle East focus, Central Asia focus, Europe focus. Where is Turkey going, or is it still an open question?
Well, this is my personal opinion. Well, definitely the decision or the view within Turkish population is not uniform. Even the AKP ruling elite sees that Turkey's salvation somehow related to Europe, to the West. But the West, they feel betrayed by the West in many areas. And until this time, they were saying that we were doing our job to be part of the West, and we are like European Union bid for Turkey, and we're not going anywhere. And so there is this new policy now that we can and we should look around for alternative alliances. And Turkey's alliance buying, for example, missiles from Russians is one example of it. Now the question is the government serious about leaving NATO and allying their defense system with the Russians, or they're just using it somehow scare the NATO members and get some concessions from them? That remains to be seen.
Of course, there's always a concern when you kind of bluff or kind of leave this question open that someone else will make a decision right now.
That's definitely a danger, but this government is not shy. The governments before, they did not take that risk to bluff. This government is very bold, and they are taking that risk. If that's the intention, though, we don't know. But I don't personally see Turkey allying themselves militarily with the Russians in the long run.
This government, of course, you mentioned the election next year, and obviously political influence on any foreign policy decision, et cetera, isn't unique to just Turkey. But to what extent are decisions being driven in Turkey right now by domestic political considerations? I mean, decisions in terms of the foreign policy, in terms of Middle East, in terms of Europe, in terms of Russia? Well, or is this a distraction?
There are those who say that this is definitely a distraction, because internally the government approval rate is hanging on a very tight line, and if the elections comes, they're not comfortable which direction it would go. And we know that these kind of operations are quite helpful if they are successful, again, in the short term for their voting. And I don't think anyone can disregard that. But there are also those that are thinking that this is the time to do it. Everyone is involved, and countries in United States are flying from thousands of miles away to interfere with the internal affairs of a country, and this is our border. How would the United States would do if a threatening group in Mexico would mount to, and they would probably involve heavily. And Turkey has every right to do it. And this is, if nothing else, this is the best time to do it, because otherwise the time will be too late. It coincides with, for them, it's a coincidence that this time and the elections are almost overlapping.
Let me ask shift to a different issue in the region where Turkey finds itself on opposite sides of Egypt and Saudi Arabia, which is the standoff in Qatar, where you actually have a Turkish base there. And of course, Turkey was not in any way part of instigating this problem, essentially, but it finds itself in a position where it's on the Qatari side. How is this going to play out, and what kind of factors is Turkey thinking about?
Well, my understanding of it, I might be wrong, is that Turkey sends military, and there are several other places too for Turkey to send military forces. This is quite interesting. I should mention that Turkish military, because of these July 15 event to topple down the government and the military, and the 40% of generals were fired or put in jail in Turkey. So Turkish military is functioning in a very limited capacity compared to before July 15, the military coup attempt in Turkey. Now, but despite that, Turkey has military bases in Iraq, in Somalia, and Qatar too. But the number is very symbolic. It's the same as United States sending 2,000 troops to Manbij, a region in Syria, that showing that, okay, if you move this way, you're not only threatening the locals, but I am in here physically. So Turkey is basically sending a message to, let's say, Saudi Arabia, that if you are thinking any military action towards Qatar, it's not just the Qatar but Turkey that you have to deal with.
Of course, we're dealing with, we're talking about military weight, and we're talking about foreign policy in that, to that extent. But what about the economic dimensions of this policy?
Well, the economic dimensions is that Qatar, for example, finances a lot of businesses in Turkey. They bought a bank in Turkey, and Turkish government is, through their indirect methods, are trying to support that bank, that they can make money. So there is also that aspect of financial aspect of doing this kind of businesses. So Turkey is in need of, Turkish economy is not as booming as say 5-10 years ago, and Turkey is surrounded by wars, Iran, Iraq, and the region is very tough. And Turkish, one of the great income provider sector for Turkey was tourism, which is not doing quite well. Turkey needs money to finance the military to fulfill the ambitions.
And of course, it also needs money for the economy to grow, which has been the key to President Erdogan's success.
Yes, definitely. And that investment, there are a lot of Arab investments in Turkey, and the money comes from, like Starbucks, for example, in Turkey, as far as I know. I did not do the research by Arab.
Other than field research and having some Starbucks coffee.
That's right. I'm contributing to that because I love Starbucks coffee, but it has to be French roast.
Let me ask you, before we veer off into coffee discussion, let me ask you a little about President Erdogan, and not in terms of his motivations necessarily, but how do you explain his not only accession, rise to power, but how he's been able to sustain that power for so long? What are the keys to his popularity? What's kept him in place for so long, and is this sustainable into the future?
I think what catapulted this movement, Islamist-backed political elite, to power is the greatest mistakes that the previous governments did. And people got very sick of terribly run economy and oppression on, let's say, headscarves, and the suspicions and this very militant secular ideas, and they wanted a change. And when this group of Islamic elite came to power, I call them Islamic elite, but that's also suspicious because the movement has that dress on it, but again, it's an umbrella group, and there are very different interest groups that support this power. And Erdogan was a very charismatic leader to take it and to walk the line. And early years of his power, he was quite accommodating for the intellectuals and the leftists, and this was a welcoming change for the Turks, for them to bring him to power. But in the second part, it became more authoritarian, and that he became more authoritarian. And as he became more authoritarian, he saw that a certain group in Turkish society love authoritarian leaders, especially in the Middle East. It seems that there is a power worship going on. The book that I'm writing now also deals with the same issue for Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. And as he become more the leader, and he become more authoritarian, and the support around it grew. Now, but at that stage, the support for Erdogan was voluntary. As he had more control, he tried to suppress and forge the opposition and oppositional parties and change the election system, and in a way that the healthy opposition cannot survive. And then he became more and more authoritarian in a way that people cannot state their opinion, although they say that everyone is free to do it. But Turkey has a very large number of journalists in jail, for example. It became more of a people are not opposing to him, they choose to be silent because of fear. And the problem with that is if they are not voicing their opinion and opposition, you don't know how powerful and what they are. The same way the secularists didn't see how powerful the Islamic movements, because they were pushed under the rug and they were quiet, and they didn't know that they had power. So now the leadership is quite uncomfortable with being this quiet in the opposition, because they don't know in which direction the voting can go, and this authoritarian in the future would lead to a leadership who has a vision and will change the future of Turkey and the region, because Turkey is a very important player in the region, let's say in an Islamically oriented way or not, or they will concede because they know that at least 50% of the population are not happy. And is there any way in a democratic society to somehow subdue this 50%? 50% is a huge number, and keep the internal peace. Or the alternative would be that, since it's split in the middle, although government supports one side, the danger is that in Turkish society there will be conflicts among the population in all fields. And that, of course, leads to the instability in the region, which is not good, and that contributes to the chaos in the Middle East.
Sure, you mentioned this 50% though, but the problem is, and correct me if I'm wrong, is 50% is a large number, but if it's not organized in any fashion.
That's right.
Well,
if they were organized, they would be more successful. They were not allowed to be organized, and to be honest, the biggest contributing factor for the AKP government having this long being in power, because it's very hard to be in power and please the people, usually 2 terms is more than long enough, is that the opposition is quite weak. We don't have in Turkey, for example, a charismatic oppositional leader to unite these groups. So it is possible to do it. Erdogan, for example, was one such figure. Despite all these pressures, was able to come out and organize the opposition. Until such a leader comes out in Turkey, that 50% will be unorganized and won't be effective. But that doesn't mean that 50% will cooperate with the policies.
Sure. What about within AKP? Is there any discussion of different leaders emerging?
Well, we hear only rumors. Some says that behind the curtains there are discussions, that there are people who are saying that, okay, this is becoming way too much. I think we have to somehow find alternatives, and we have to soften, because if you become that tense within the society, that's detrimental for their
Sure.
well-being too. So there are some group that are thinking about that, but it's very hard to get any good sense, because the party discipline, they call it, is not very visible to the naked eye. Only rumors we hear. I would assume these rumors have some truth to it.
Let me ask, because at the time of the Arab Spring, if you can call it that, but that's for lack of a better term, when you had all these revolts against the Arab leaders, Turkey was seen as perhaps a model of a democratic transition to an Islamist government that was still pursuing secular objectives and focusing primarily on the economy, and it was seen as a model. Obviously, the way things have changed within these different countries and within Turkey have kind of proved that model wrong, but can Turkey again be a seen as a leader for the region?
I don't think so. Because, Egypt has its own agenda. The Saudis, they have their own agenda. No one wants to have Turkey they want to see Turkey as an ally and as a strong ally that could defend their interests too in the international arena. But seeing Turkey as the leader of, let's say, the neo-Ottomanist ideology, I think it's just a dream. I don't see Egypt or other countries or go along with that and give up. Although the ambitions are there, the reality is that it is possible, at least in the Middle Eastern Islamic world, the competition for power, regional power, will continue. So Turkey, I don't see Turkey as being the leader, the big brother of the Sunni groups in the Middle East.
Let me ask you, looking at Turkey, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia in particular, because we've mentioned them a couple different times, do they understand each other's policies and objectives? Or is that part of the reason you have some of this tension?
I think there's a great saying, I think they say this is a conversation of the deaf. They're talking, but they're not listening to each other. So I seriously doubt that they understand each other. Even if they understand, they always think there is an alternative motive in their communications. They don't trust. The trust does not exist in the Middle East.
Has Washington's role changed? For example, was Washington helpful in bringing this to parties that distrust each other, to kind of bringing an element of stability within their relations?
I think, at least in Turkey, Washington lost its credibility big time. There is a study recently done to show that which country Turkey sees the enemy. The first is the United States of America. So that's number one. Not necessarily enemy, but someone that wishes Turkey ill. So public opinion in Turkey does not really trust. And an elite too also, they don't trust the United States being an honest broker and they can solve this problem. And of course this Jerusalem decision by the Trump administration is another way of saying that US is not to be trusted. Kurds are thinking the same way now, that each time United States call us, we try to help them out. And of course when we need help, they just desert us. So I do not see any trust for Washington in the Middle East, other than the groups that the United States is now supporting.
Well, you mentioned Jerusalem, and of course President Erdogan has used the Israeli-Palestinian issue actually to increase his influence in the Arab world by being a supporter of the Palestinians. How does this play at home?
It plays quite well. The Jerusalem issue in Turkey and other Islamic countries is a great issue to exploit, and Trump administration is giving the fuel to these groups to get more votes. I'm sure in election time that will be used, and anti-Americanism will be used. So United States policies towards the Middle East are helping more of these Islamist countries retain their power and expand their power base too. And some are saying that U.S. is doing it for a reason. They're doing it on purpose so that these people would be, and they are calling these Islamist movements as stooges of the United States anyway, because they're supported by the United States in many different ways. And United States doing these things are another way of, it's a very cynical way of looking at it, but that also exists in the Middle East.
Let me turn to your own book. Can you tell us a little about what you're researching and working on right now?
In a nutshell, the book that I am trying to research and write is quite relevant to what's happening today, actually, but it deals with the transition period from the collapse of a major Ottoman Empire and rise of nation states. There's an American diplomat that was stationed after World War I in the Middle East, Admiral Mark Bristol. Mark Bristol was an avid note-taker. And when he was in 1919, the Ottoman Empire was not collapsed entirely. He was in charge of all Ottoman territories. He would collect all the information from, let's say, Jerusalem, from Anatolia, and from different parts of the empire, and send it to Washington. So what I am looking, I'm not looking at the Arab provinces, but I am looking at what kind of reports he sent. These are like the WikiLeaks of the period. Secret reports, the interviews, and people that, and the interactions with the oppositional leaders, and how the Kemalist regime emerged, and how the Kemalists interacted with the Americans, and how the Americans decided to somehow be a supporter of this new regime as opposed to an enemy to the regime. So these are the questions I found in his correspondence to the State Department. The book basically deals with his tenure This is between 1919 till 1927. It's an amazing period that see all these changes. So when empire collapsed and the new regime in Turkey emerged, and how Turkey became such militantly secularistic.
What were some of the symbols used by Ataturk that kind of, you were talking a little earlier about Erdogan using some of the same kinds of techniques as Ataturk used?
Well, I see similarities between Mustafa Kemal establishing this new regime. Keep in mind that when he came to power, Turkish society came out of 10 years of war, at least, starting from the Balkan Wars onwards. They were tired. But the society was also, these people are the members of the Ottoman military, and the society was Ottoman. Ottoman Empire was a major power for 600 years. So changing something for 600 years, especially dealing with religion, and it was requires quite an impressive leadership. Mustafa Kemal accomplished that, but many people think this was done through convincing. It wasn't done through convincing. So the methods that Mustafa Kemal employed was quite autocratic, actually. And the methods Erdogan is using is actually very similar, except the times are different, of course, and there are differences. But to change the society who has been somehow educated as a secular, militantly secular in a sense, to change that, you cannot really go one by one and try to convince people, because you have a very limited time in power, and you have to be, they call it leader, the opposition calls it dictatorship, so you can use whatever terminology you use. And Mustafa Kemal did not shy away from dealing with, I don't want to say religion because it's wrong. Most people think Mustafa Kemal dealt with religion. Mustafa Kemal did not deal with religion. Mustafa Kemal dealt with religious functionaries. That was a very powerful caste of group within the society. And Mustafa Kemal saw that in a new regime, this group would be a hindrance to the westernization, and their use of religion would be also a quite hindrance of modernization. He identified that as a handicap and dealt with the religious functionaries, religious authorities. Now what Erdogan is trying to reverse that process, he's trying to give more power to these religious functionaries and bring religion to the fore. But Turkey has never been a secular. Secularism, if you think of secularism as separation of church of state, religion and state, Turkey always, the elite, the political elite, wants to subdue the other group. So religion during the Mustafa Kemal's time was basically a subordinate to the state, not separate from the state. This government, people think, have Islamist agenda to make religion separate and independent. No, this government also wants religious groups to be subordinate to the state, but they bring in more religion to the fore, that their support can be included and they can be used as a political rallying point. The problem with that is when religion comes to picture, it's very hard to oppose. People cannot come out and state their opinion, and people are not able to show their distaste for certain things, because immediately those who are using religion wrap that issue in a religious way to make it sacred, that the opposition would stop. For that reason, democracy in Turkey is not functioning, in my opinion, the way it should.
Well, you mentioned Bristol being a note taker.
Yes.
He was very accurate in your opinion in terms of what
in
was
my
going
opinion,
on?
Yes. He was a quite good, his observations are quite accurate. Of course, I mean, he didn't have any background before. He came and it was settled after wartime. He was taking notes and he was sending to Washington, D.C. And at the same time, he was not buying the overall Turks are animal, vicious predators narrative. He was trying to somehow bring them to the human level. And his observations are quite, in my opinion, fair. That's why I think the book will be important to see, although he has his own enemies, because he was immediately labeled as pro-Turk. That's a scarlet letter to put someone on to discredit that immediately. But I like to bring that reports in full to people's reading so that they can make their own opinion about it.
Do you have a sense that the U.S. doesn't have the same kind of accurate reporting on what's going on inside Turkey today, or is it a mixed bag?
I really don't know what, I mean, we will see that 30, 40 years or 70 years from today, a historian will come out and hopefully these reports will be accurate and, opened up to the public, and we're going to see what they are sending. Well, that's one issue. The other issue is that I don't know in Washington how seriously they are reading and understanding these reports. I do not know if the West, not necessarily the United States, but even Europe, understands Turkey quite well. And Turkey, even Turks don't understand Turkey quite well. And that's very important to keep in mind too. Lumping Turkey as one unit is a very big mistake, and these variations must be dealt with. The journalists would come and they do, without even knowing the language, they just go and talk certain political elite, and they put those things on.
Have their own
on
spin
TV.
on.
Exactly, and then the Turkey you see on Western media is quite different than what actually, if you live there, you would see.
Hakan Ozoglu, thank you very much.
You're most welcome.
Joining us in.